I'm Whynde Kuehn. I'm a longtime business architecture practitioner, industry thought leader. I run a company called S2E Consulting, and I focus on business architecture not only from a corporate perspective, but also from a social good perspective. I'm a co-founder of the Business Architecture Guild, also on the board of directors, and I'm the editorial board chair of the Guild, which means I am, along with the rest of the team, responsible for all the content that goes out globally from the Guild. The Business Architecture Guild has had really incredible progress that we are quite proud of. We were founded in 2010, and we've launched a lot of different programs, everything from a robust body of knowledge called the BizBot Guide, or the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge. We put out 2 updates per year to that, industry white papers, monthly webinars. We run anywhere from 1 to 3 events per year, summits and workshops that are actually hands-on for people to come to. We've launched a certification program, training accreditation program. We've also created some industry reference models, which are getting a lot of use right now for capability maps and value streams, with more focus on the profession on the horizon. Business architecture, when you really look at what it is, it's a set of multidimensional views for an organization. And that is really for the organization and the scope of its entire ecosystem. That's an important point. But what's more interesting is what we do with those views, right? So the views are made up of, at the core, capabilities, value streams, organization, and information. And then there's an extended set of domains such as strategy and policy, products, stakeholders, metrics, and so on, initiatives. But what's really interesting is what we do with the business architecture, because we find there's a gap between strategy and taking really big ideas and putting them into action in a cohesive and coordinated way across business units. So business architecture is used to bridge that gap. That set of views is used to bridge that gap for everything from transformations to mergers and acquisitions to implementing major regulatory changes. Sorry, yeah. We like to say that business architects steward the business architecture repository or knowledge base, but it's really the business people that own the content of that knowledge base. And if you think about the knowledge base as something that's reusable, it's a reusable set of views of the business at a high level. And anytime we want to enact change within the organization, whether it's for transformation or whatever it may be, we decide what changes are needed to those views. And it's the business people working hand in hand with architects that decide what changes are made. We bundle those changes into initiatives, but the business architects may steward those changes as well as the repository, but the business people really own the direction of the company and own the blueprints, frankly. Business architects own the architectural decisions. For example, let's say we're doing a transformation. They would recommend to business leaders where we might want to find reuse. But at the end of the day, business architects are really recommending to business people how we translate their ideas into action. So if you think about this in 2 ways, the business architecture knowledge base, and then changes we want to make to the knowledge base. The knowledge base views are really the current state at this point. And depending on how much you have your business architecture built out, at the core of the knowledge base, there are value streams, and there are capabilities mapped to those value streams. Once you have that, you can get to the rest of the business architecture pieces. You can get to the IT architecture pieces. And if you have everything mapped out, you can get to the operating model pieces, like, for example, process. So if that is all current state, When you want to make a change to the business, and again, that direction comes from business people, and architects would work with them to translate it, also working in hand with IT architects to translate, then we could actually have future state views in our repository as well based on where we're going. Now, people create special artifacts, particularly as they create major changes, like let's say for a business transformation. We'll create diagrams or a set of diagrams that may be generated from the knowledge base that show us, for example, what is the company going to look like in the future state. We also create key artifacts like strategic roadmaps, which are business-focused ways to bundle initiatives, people, process, and technology changes. They're based on architecture changes that show us where we're going in the future, but they're not programs and projects. That gets translated down the line. A lot of people question modeling current state, but I think there's a big difference in the level of detail that we capture in a business architecture knowledge base, and that's the whole art and the whole power in it. The architecture is documented at a high level, so we see the forest for the trees. So, for example, the level of detail that we capture in capabilities and value streams is very attainable in a short time. Now, we can choose where to go into to detail, let's say in the operating model, where we want to map out processes, because that can take a long time. But when we look at our high-level architecture, business architecture, that needs to be current state, so we know what it is we do today. So when we want to make change, we know exactly where to go. So in terms of tools, it's important to think about business architecture and the knowledge base as a baseline, right? That's your starting point. And again, you're going to build that out over time, because if you were to map out all the business architecture and all the domains that exist, that would take some time. But assuming you have a knowledge base, some of in the core there would be capability and value stream, but some of the other tools that are useful or techniques that are useful are things like the business model canvas. The business model canvas documents at a high level how the organization is structured, how it delivers value, customers, partners, and so on. And as we decide to shift that business model, it provides a good way to represent changes to the business, which can flow down through to the architecture. I also think, even more than recommending a set of tools or techniques, it's extremely important for architects to understand how they interact with other disciplines. So, for example, customer experience designers are a very key team that we work with, and a business architect needs to understand customer journeys so that we can inform them, but also be able to consume customer journeys that a designer creates so that we can translate them into action. Same important to understand how we work with planning teams, or how we work with process teams, or even, of course, how we work with IT architects and downstream business analysts. I work with a lot of startups, so my answer is you always need a business architect. But that answer, obviously, how robustly you implement it is going to depend on the size of the organization. Yeah. Business consultants can perform all sorts of roles, I think, in different scenarios. And a consultant or an external person can be acting as a business architect for an organization. But the key aspects of a business architect role are really three things. One is creating the knowledge base. The second is using that knowledge base in certain scenarios. And the third is, especially as your practice grows, being able to establish and mature a business architecture practice, everything from defining the role and training and socialization and integration with other disciplines. So, for example, the difference between, let's say, a general consultant and maybe a business architect is, let's just take the example of a merger and an acquisition. If our company is looking at acquiring another company, the way I use my architecture, not just general analysis techniques, but actually using an architecture to base decisions on and using it as a communication framework is the difference between being a business architect and performing the same scenario as a general consultant. Many business consultants could likely become business architects, right? Especially if they are big picture thinkers, they think abstractly, they synthesize all those thought processes that are important to architects, communication, influence. But the difference is learning the sets of skills, in particular, how to create an industry-aligned and robust business architecture knowledge base, and then learning how to apply it in specific situations. So just to give you one example, I could do a business transformation and create a bunch of pretty pictures that are going to show what the target state is, but it's a very different thing to use a defined business architecture baseline and use those established pieces on my target architecture to represent the changes in what the future organization is going to look like. Yeah. So what I think architects have in common, which is pretty special, is it's a way of thinking and a little bit of a way of being. We are the big picture thinkers. We can't help thinking about the big picture. We connect the dots. We think structurally. We abstract. We categorize. We think long term. We think about tying results back to business outcomes. We ask hard questions. We ask why. So I think it's a base there of traits in an architect. But we have different specializations in terms of the content we put in a knowledge base and the way we work together as we use the content in a knowledge base within a scenario. So for example, as we're doing a transformation, a business architect works closely with, let's say, an application architect and an information architect, even a technical architect to get to the infrastructure. And another difference in the architects is if those folks are looking at the overall, the bigger picture, a solution architect gets involved in a smaller scope, maybe a piece of that transformation. Especially if we're positioned in a way that enables us in an organization, I think architects can be very objective and they can be cross-business unit thinkers. And that might even be a little bit of a luxury, because when we work with a lot of people, of course, they want to think of themselves as visionary and long-term thinkers, but and they might say that. But when we really look at what our organizations are doing and how we're thinking, I think our business unit boundaries and even things like the stock market force us to be short-term thinkers. They may force us to think about what is working and what we need within our business unit. We're not always enterprise thinkers. And I think people tend to think in initiatives. I think there's a momentum to do stuff, to have projects. And what architects remind us to do is to look across business unit and say, is there an opportunity to reuse this? And maybe we can't deliver the project as fast as we want because we have to hold things up for a little bit in order to, combine two projects that make sense. And I think in the pressure to deliver projects and deliver fast, we also need to think about, are we doing the right things? Because otherwise we're just speeding up the delivery of the wrong things, potentially. The right thing should be tied back to our overall strategies. Companies usually, of course, have an overall strategy, business unit strategies, digital strategies, workplace strategies, lots of them. Those things need to be harmonized, and they're not always. But anything we deliver should be tied back to our key business direction, and we find that organizations are really trying to do a bit of everything in the end. So the architecture gives us a traceability that otherwise we don't have, or we don't have at an enterprise level. So we take strategies, we break them down into specific objectives. Those objectives impact one or more value streams. Within those value streams, there are capabilities impacted. And once you have that intersection of value stream and capability, then you know the IT architecture pieces that are impacted and the rest of the operating model impacts of the people and the process. Now, as we make changes to the business and IT architecture, we bundle those into initiatives. So if we have traceability from strategy, objective, value stream, capability down to initiative, we can say things like, did this initiative actually tie back to the objectives, the business objectives that it was supposed to, and the measurable objectives that we had defined? To get to measurable objectives, that is a little bit easier said than done, because sometimes as we come up with business direction, it can be challenging to get concrete on it. So this is a process of working with the business leaders and or a strategy team to get them into SMART objectives that we can actually act upon. Sometimes there's a course of action piece in there as well, or some sort of themes to help us translate how that's going to impact the architecture as well. So I think the metrics that we see tied to objectives are really a broad range. They could be everything from, efficiency-focused things on cost, all the way ranging to customer experience, which frankly there's a major trend really globally to have organizations that are more focused on customers. So we see people looking deeper there to try to measure customer experience and even lifelong value in things like that. A key thing, too, is to tie your metrics to your architecture. So, for example, I know if I want to impact customer experience, which capabilities would I target to do that? Most organizations have to take a really practical approach to establishing a business architecture practice. We see today, and this will hopefully continue to change as architecture grows in the future, but today we see business architecture practices starting by an advocate. Might be a business architect or somebody that's not named a business architect yet, might be their manager, might be a leader in the organization, but it usually is a single or a small group of advocates that started within an organization. And when that's the case, sort of the roadmap that we see is those practitioners or managers or leaders first understand business architecture, what it is and isn't, and how it fits within the rest of enterprise architecture. Once they have an understanding of that, may create a team. That may be a team of one or two, but there's some level of organizational buy-in at that point, even if small. And then they go off on two parallel tracks. And one of those tracks, from a practical standpoint, is creating the architecture knowledge base and using it. And the other path is maturing the practice. And those two things have to occur in harmony. I can't emphasize enough, though, that the reason why we all exist as architects is to provide value to the business and value to IT. So that really needs to be our guiding light through all of this. But we provide a way to translate business direction into a coordinated set of actions across the enterprise. And never has there been a more important time for us to do that as our organizations have gotten larger, as customer experience and the transparency of our organizations shows through to our external customers and partners. We have got to think enterprise and work across business units, and architecture is the way we do that. And And first of all, it's not, I just want to be really clear that it's not, no group is doing it wrong, right? All groups, many teams need to work together from strategy to execution to get an idea, really manifested into action. But the differentiators, what I think architecture brings to the table is that reusable blueprint at a high level that gives us the forest for the trees, that allows us to see across business unit and allows us to, in a measurable and consistent way, actually translate it. We also provide the traceability, not just in artifacts, but in the way we knit teams together to bring strategy into a concrete set of changes, into changes to the business and IT environment, into initiatives that are scoped top down, so they're not overlapping and they're tied back to the most important objectives, all the way down to the initiatives and ensuring that they deliver on the results we expect. So the traceability and the reuse of the knowledge base saves a lot of time and brings a reusable approach to this that spans business units. I think a couple messages that are important to me. One is to remain value focused. I think we play a critical role in our organizations, particularly at this time in history, with all the change that our organizations need to deal with. So it's an exciting time for us, a critical time for us, but we need to be united. We need to focus on value. The frameworks, the knowledge base are critical doing what we do, but we are about the business, not just about the architecture. And the second thing I would add is this very valuable set of skills we have and passions that we have can and should be used for good. So as you have opportunities, whether it's in your local community or on a global basis, I encourage you to use your skills for good, whether it's to help out your church or nonprofit or a social initiative, or just use them to make a difference.